Good evening, and thank you to Dr. Graeme Sullivan, of course, and Dr. Keifer-Boyd, and the art education faculty for inviting me to talk about my journey to becoming a professor and to respond to graduate research presentations. I haven't been to one for a while, but I can echo Karen in saying that I remember going to the first one and looking around and thinking these are going to be the people who are like my professors in 10 and 15 years. These will be the people who will be writing and doing research and teaching. And for the most part, that's come true. Ryan and I were talking earlier about who we started with, and I was in the cohort with Sharif. Bob Sweeney was just finishing. Michelle Tillender came right after us. Yeah, so these are the people who are going to be doing the work in 5-10 years. It will happen. I'm so pleased to be one of the keynote speakers here and to be in the midst of, like I said, some of our most promising graduate student thinkers and doers. I'm doubly excited to be doing so at the university, where I not only earned my doctoral degree, but where I spent nearly 17 of the 20+ years of my career in the field of art museum education. I attended, along with Dr. Patton, the very first GRAE conference in 2005, and I will never forget my presentation. Not because of a particularly spectacular delivery, or because of any discussion that it might have engendered, but because I was newly pregnant with my first child, and I spent the entire day feeling miserable and trying not to throw up in front of my student peers and professors. That was what I remember from that day. And I remember sitting on College Avenue with Ryan and Bob and not saying anything and not saying anything. I don't even know if they noticed, but I just felt like I finally had to explain why I was such a not a very good dining companion. Ryan doesn't remember any of this. How can you remember this? So while that may seem like an odd anecdote to begin a professional talk, it in some ways perfectly encapsulates the inextricable connections between my personal, professional, and academic lives, in addition to my preferred method of communication, which is sharing stories that help me make sense of the world. So today I'll talk about my somewhat unorthodox professional trajectory and how it informs my work as an educator, a researcher, a scholar, and a learner. I think, again, when we're talking about our cohorts, a lot of times people have a group of people that they teach with and they hang out with, and that was not my experience because I worked full-time when I was going through school. And instead of teaching one of the 303 classes, I taught a museum studies class on behalf of the museum. So I feel like I got to do a lot of the same things, but it wasn't necessarily with my group of friends. And while I still think we're close, it wasn't quite the same experience, maybe. It wasn't a very traditional experience. Okay, so let me see if I can. There we go. I am currently an assistant professor of art museum education and faculty director of the museum specialization at The Ohio State University. And if you go to the orientation the first day, right, when you become a professor, they have people there to take your picture. So this is the picture that I got the first day at orientation for my professional photo, and I thought I would take advantage of that. So now I can say I've used Ohio State's resources responsibly. And here is the OSU Department of Arts Administration Education and Policy site with the museum education specialization on it. I am just now starting to get students, so I don't know who that person is, but I know she's doing a great job somewhere. Okay. So I was until this summer, I was until July, the curator of education at the Palmer Museum of Art. Oops, there we go. And an affiliate assistant professor of art education at Penn State. But my own art museum education began a long time before that. And on the top right, I'm actually giving a talk to dogs that are in training to be seeing eye dogs. And of course, they are there for a social experience. And the person who wrote about it in the student paper wrote that I chose certain works of art because I thought the dogs would like them. That was awesome. So I was at the Palmer from 2000 until 2017, and as you will see as I sort of go through this talk, my experiences there were just as much as a part of my education as my doctoral work. I trained to be a volunteer docent at the Spencer Museum of Art at the University of Kansas in 1995. And I worked as a curatorial intern in art museum education, learning pedagogical strategies that enabled me to teach others about original works of art in gallery contexts. I wrote gallery guides about the techniques and purposes of baskets woven by the last itinerant basket maker in Japan. And I curated a small show about Kara Walker, trembling, literally trembling, as I struggled to write didactic text about the nature of work that I was not so sure could be conveyed in words. I had a mission, and that mission was to help people understand what they could not, I suspected, understand on their own. My first professional position as the coordinator of docent and interpretive programs at the Philbrook Museum of Art in Tulsa, Oklahoma, gave me the opportunity to hone my skills working with docent volunteers and conducting adult and family programming. Now, the difference between teaching a corps of adult volunteers to work with the public and actually working with the public could not be more different, though the lessons that I learned from both of these groups were in some ways the same. You see adult, mostly upper class, mostly women, volunteering their time, do not care what their 22-year-old newly minted docent educator thinks is the right way to talk about art. They want to share what they know and what they learn with you. This is literally why they became docents. And so my art museum education continued as I learned to honor their contributions to our discussions, classes, and educational programs as manifestations of their educational commitment, rather than a mimicry of the techniques of their not-so-fearless leader. And I also learned that the thoughts and opinions of visitors to the museum, no matter how astute or unsophisticated, had meaning, because they were the result of a social interaction between human beings, based on an object or objects that evoked interest, wonder, and sometimes disagreements. So that is actually a museum. Can you believe that? It's a 72-room mansion that has an education wing on the side. And that was an interesting challenge because in addition to having a really great collection, they had rooms where the docents had talked a lot about how the family had, had bowled in the top floor, like how they use the hallway as a bowling alley. And when you're just getting out of graduate school, it's really hard to wrap your head around how someone could have a house like that. But they had an amazing collection, and it was absolutely a good first experience as a museum educator. I joined the staff at the Palmer Museum of Art, and a year later, I began the Ph.D. program in art education. He's not here tonight, so I can say this. Because when you start a job across the street from one of the best art education programs in the country, and Dr. Charles Goroyan approaches you in the lobby of a hotel at NAEA and says, "So, when are you going to start the PhD program?" You go home and you start studying for the GRAE, or for the GRE. Like, that's the first thing you do. You think, I better get on that. So I did. And so my art museum education began to include theory and history and classes and visual culture retreats and critical pedagogy and post-structuralism. And my success as a practitioner started to be based, in my mind, on the ways in which I translated those things to the work that I did every day in the art museum. And I do think it's worth mentioning here, and we're all past this point, but I still feel like no matter how long you've been doing something or how sort of adequate you start feeling, there's always that momentary, kind of like I'm feeling now, like they've got to know that I'm not really like you have a little bit of imposter syndrome. It happens. So I very clearly recall reaching out for the handle of the door that led to my very first class with Dr. Marianne Stankiewicz. I reached out for the handle and I said, I don't know that I can do this. I don't know about this. And it was humbling, and it was hard, and it was worth every single moment. My dissertation research, completed in 2010 with Dr. Marianne Stankiewicz as my chair, and Drs. Kim Powell and Yvonne Gedalius on my committee, explored the growth and transformation of the field of art museum education during the political and social upheavals of the late 1960s and early 1970s. My work was an attempt to make sense of my personal experiences as an art museum educator. I was on one hand fascinated with the history of an under-theorized and somewhat neglected field, but at another, more personal level, I was desperately trying to understand the discourses that have shaped a profession that is both dominated by women and queer men and enacted in a distinctly gendered institutional hierarchy. Consequently, I utilized a feminist interpretation of Foucault's genealogy to make sense of the rupture or discontinuity in the field, which enabled a vast transformation of art museum education from a job to a profession within the span of about 5 or 6 years. So in 1968 or 69, if you went in to be an educator at a museum, you would likely have been under an education director, usually male, somebody who probably didn't have an art education background. A lot of times they had art history or art practice. They were artists. There was no degree. There were no readings that were peer-reviewed. There were no journals about museum education. It really was much more of sort of being a teacher. I sort of liken it to when a teacher teaches lessons that are based on a district curriculum. It's kind of what you would have been doing there. But by the time all 3 of these women sort of left their first positions in about 1975, NAEA had a women museum education division. The American Alliance of Museums, which used to be the American Association of Museums, they had a museum, it's called EdCom, Education Committee. The Journal of Museum Education had started. There were different degrees that you could get at a master's level to be a museum educator. So huge, huge shift in a very, very short period of time. So oral history interviews with 3 American art museum educators from the time. Elaine Human-Gurian, who is, Elaine Human-Gurian, who I hope you recognize that name. She's here, right there, with some of her colleagues from the Boston Children's Museum. She was a museum educator at the MCA Boston, who's now a legend in the field of museums, traveling around to lands near and far and advising leaders on establishing museums. She gets paid to go to countries and tell them how best to establish cultural institutions. I don't know about you, but I want that job someday. Carol Stapp, an art historian turned art museum educator, turned director of the museum education certification at the George Washington University. And Linda Sweet, a partner in management consultant for the arts, a company that finds qualified candidates for major arts and cultural jobs, including the recent search for the new director of the Palmer Museum of Art. And she started out at the Brooklyn Museum as an educator. So these conversations revealed a very particular set of similarities in their subjectivities. The social and familial expectations placed upon them as girls, which is one of the ways I got the title to my dissertation, which is Good Girls, Left-Wing Ladies, and Merry Bands, a new generation of art museum educators in the 1970s. And by the way, when you have your interview, when you have an interview for a position, and one of the deans sees that this is the title of your dissertation, they will say, that sounds like it might make an interesting book. And yes, maybe it will. These conversations revealed a very particular set of similarities in their subjectivities, the social and familial expectations placed upon them as girls, their progressive social and political ideologies as adults, and their ability to form research and practice cohorts within their institutions changed the course of the field of art museum education. Contemporaneously, museums were beginning a vast philosophical change, from being object-centered endeavors to organizations that became more focused on the needs of visitors, communities, and schools. The curatorial imperative of collecting and exhibiting that had maintained primacy in art museums was fractured when postmodern discourses of power and privilege began to filter into the institutional consciousness of museum staffs, and government funding structures changed to favor educational and community-based institutions. And by that, I mean 501c3 status, it's taxes essentially. And from those women, I learned that there is no real separation between the personal and the political, and that the values that shape you as a human being are instrumental in the ways that you approach both your work and your life. For many years, my responsibilities as a museum educator were quite typical. They included creating opportunities for interpretation and engagement for visitors of all ages. And hey, look, there's Brian right there, right there. At the Palmer. I worked with a core of 40 or so docents to create a culture of free choice learning by conceptualizing the volunteers as lifelong learners who provided a human point of contact and interaction for the vast number of visitors who walked through their doors. I created year-round public education curriculum for pre-K and elementary students who visited mostly from a 4-county region, but occasionally from as far away as Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia. These offerings included, but were not limited to, thematic pre-visits, tours and activities, art-related story times for very young audiences, and weekend art-making workshops taught by local art educators and artists, including many students from this program. How many people are sitting here now who taught a class at the Palmer? Oh, really? Just a couple? Oh, Sharif. Wow, okay. Wow. Okay, so I supervised a 12-week summer internship program, which I was really proud because it was a paid internship program, and that's something that doesn't happen all the time. And I recruited, interviewed, selected, and supervised 4 to 5 Penn State graduate students. I would often work with unpaid students who needed either experience or internship credits. And I worked with various faculty, instructors, staff, and graduate students from across the university to incorporate the museum into their courses through thematic tours, classes that focused on a particular collection, theme, or medium, and class papers and projects that used objects as a point of departure. And in doing so, I learned to speak eloquently about works of art and become a connector in my community. I met artists and makers and creatives and educators, and I became adept at working within the institutional cultures of both art museums and universities. And this was this picture. I just like the way I looked in it. That's really why I chose it. But it's from a salon conversation after Black Lives Matter and museums respond to Ferguson. The museum responded to Ferguson in a salon conversation. And the topic was art's role in social justice. Because I was situated at a Research One university with an art education program, I also had the opportunity to act in a small academic capacity, serving on graduate committees, teaching upper-level undergraduate courses on museum studies, and a class on contemporary women artists, which is still one of the favorite things I've ever done, and conducting research with colleagues. One of the projects that most directly shaped my current research agenda emerged from a conversation with Dr. B. Stephen Carpenter II about the ways in which we might collectively contribute to the repair of what was then a fairly significant wound for our academic and surrounding communities. This shared commitment quickly took the shape of the Summer Institute on Contemporary Art, both a conceptual and physical space wherein we explored themes of contemporary art, pedagogy, and dialogic teaching with 20 teachers, museum educators, docents, and graduate students each summer for the next 5 years. We focused on co-constructing knowledge with participants and using contemporary art objects to foster deep conversations about our pedagogical values, teaching practices, and new ideas and strategies for using contemporary art in the classroom. We expanded from a 2-hour-a-day workshop for 4 days to an all-day, week-long event with invited art education scholars in residence, guest speakers from our esteemed Penn State faculty and staff, and opportunities for critical responses through art making. Now, raise your hand if you have been one of the guest speakers or art education scholars in residence for SECA. Aaron, really? I'm surprised there's not more. A lot of Penn State people have been really generous with their time on that one. In my own art museum education, it helped me to be more agile as an educator, become more intimate with the worlds that our public and private school teachers inhabit, and to learn what kind of experiences they find useful and meaningful in terms of professional development. In fact, SECA so affected how, I think I can say this, both Steve and I, considered the relationships between art museum educators, art education, teachers, and their students, that we decided to study the specific ways in which it shaped the community of scholars who participated, especially as they seemed to form a cohort or an ongoing community of practice in support of one another, both under the auspices of SECA and in their school environments. It encouraged an ongoing interest in the ways that professional development for art teachers is conceptualized and carried out in the museum context, which then led to another big project, the book. Dr. Carpenter and I sought to ground our summer institute in published scholarship, but found scant literature on professional development for art teachers as it occurs in art museums. Paradoxically, art museum educators frequently share information on the work that they do with teachers in conferences, forums, pre-conferences, Google chats, and now even peer-reviewed online publications. For you museum ed folks, you might have seen Viewfinder, which is a new peer-reviewed online source publication where art museum educators are writing about what they do, and it's getting published fairly quickly. Steve and I felt strongly that the gap in published literature needed to be filled and that it was important to include the voices of practicing art museum educators and scholars, including graduate students. I should also ask how many of our graduate students are in that book. I think all of them have. They're either presenting tomorrow or they've graduated. In order to situate the work theoretically, conceptually, and in practice, and that is in fact the way that we structured the book. Our resulting co-authored compendium, Professional Development in Art Museums, Strategies of Engagement Through Contemporary Art, is now in the process of publication with the National Art Education Association, and we hope to be signing the book at NAEA in the spring. I'm picking out pens now, as a matter of fact. The book features 30 authors, including Dr. Carpenter and myself, and is focused particularly on translations and examinations of theory and practice at the intersection of collaborative professional development, art museums, and works of contemporary art. We privilege contemporary artworks as catalysts to examine theoretical and philosophical influences, contextual and conceptual groundings, innovative practices, and future directions of professional development in conjunction with art museums. It is on a very short list of books that highlight the voices of practitioners and scholars alike, which we hope will disrupt a perceived hierarchy between art and museum educators and art and museum education scholars. I did want to, this photo is the last SECA week that we did. There are people there from Florida, there are people there from Bellefonte, there are people there from Pittsburgh, teaching artists. I don't see any docents. I think we had a graduate student or two with us this year. This year kind of threw us for a loop because the Palmer, which was the main provider of the contemporary work that we talked about, closed for some remodeling, renovation. And so we thought we might talk about art and social engagement, art and social practice. And it was one of the most fun times. Like it was great. They did a great job. And that's probably where I got the thing about being a little more agile about my teaching, because that could have ended not so great, and it didn't. It ended really well. So as I embark, and this is why this talk is this way and not like Ryan's is going to be. As I embark on my 11th week of teaching as an assistant professor, I endeavor to center my research within 3 interests that inform a broader trajectory of a more contemporary and inclusive art museum education, where theory and practice converge. These interests include theorizing the positionality of both visitors and art museum educators in art museums, professional development for art teachers, and exploring the pedagogical possibilities of digital technology and social media in the art museum. Thus, my art museum education is now, in part, a process of my own making. My lived experience directs my inquiries while theory informs and shapes them. And this is a photo from just, I guess, a week ago with some of the graduate students from the Arts Education Administration and Policy, Arts Administration Education and Policy program. I'll get it right. I will, because I work there. And this is with Allison Sarr, who came as part of this really wonderful conference on curating and making Black art. And so she came to give a keynote at this really wonderful exhibition that is at the Urban Arts Center, which is a downtown gallery that's co-sponsored by Ohio State. And so she came and talked with the students in our program before giving her talk. And so on the left is James Sanders, who is from our program. And on the right is Christopher Janson, who just finished who just became ABD. And the other students are mostly new, and then Allison is in the middle. And I felt very comfortable reaching out to the people who organized the conference, because I had actually worked with Allison before at the Palmer Museum of Art. And one of the things I'm very concerned about is making sure that people who are in the museum specialization work with contemporary artists in the same way that I did at the Palmer, which was to really know them and feel more comfortable with them as people, because it's a really important part of doing work at a museum. And she was very gracious and really funny. So my primary interest is the ongoing exploration of visitor-centered philosophies and practices in art museums within the broader field of museology. Art museums have long reveled in an aura of authenticity and authority by displaying rare and precious objects, presenting seemingly non-negotiable facts, valuing forms of creative work and labor over others, and transmitting values through carefully selected permanent collections and curated exhibitions. While the task of connecting these objects with visitors has long been the purview of art museum educators, museum staff members are still wrestling with how exactly, and in some cases if, their organization should respond to specific events and issues within their local and national communities. Examples of socially responsive programs are becoming more and more common. For example, museums throughout North America are responding at a national level to contemporary events, such as ongoing racially motivated shootings and the national Black Lives Matter movement, by providing space, organizing events, and contributing to social media conversations with #MuseumsRespondToFerguson and #MuseumsAreNotNeutral. Museum educators are engaging in the complicated conversations that must be had in order to create truly inclusive spaces. NAEA pre-conferences and sessions, entire issues of the Journal of Museum Education, the Museum Next conference, all of them are focusing on issues of race, inclusion, diversity, sexual orientation, and ethnicity as they play out in historically elitist institutions with staffs that often do not represent the diversity found in their communities. I'm curious about the effect that this has on museums as a whole, and art museum educators in particular. If museums become just as rooted in programs and communities as they are in exhibitions, what does that mean for educators and their relationship to the rest of the museum staff, their responsibilities, their methods and practices, and their expectations. Recent museological theory, particularly post-critical museologies, as framed by British scholars Andrew Dewdney, David Dubosa, and Victoria Walsh, suggest a radical revisioning of art museums that is situated in the present moment and not in history, based on a more global conception of the art museum public that regards the voices of learners as paramount and is shaped by collaborations with museum professionals, academics, and audiences. If in fact museums are moving toward this paradigm of practice, how would it change the relationships between museums, the academy, schools, and the public? I'm also interested in how professional development for teachers might be carried out in my current institution with the resources available in Columbus and Ohio State. I think in art education, we spend an awful lot of time preparing pre-service art teachers for their experiences with students and other teachers, but are perhaps not as diligent at preparing future art museum educators to work with teachers, audiences, and artists in ways that expand traditional notions of collaboration, curriculum, and learning. My experiences with SECA have cultivated a desire to extend a summer institute in my current environment, but the available resources, including the Wexner Center for the Arts, the Columbus Museum of Art, and the Urban Art Space, may allow for a larger, perhaps more complex set of exchanges based on a model first employed by the contemporary art organization Art 21. A few years ago, Creative Chemistries, Radical Practices for Art and Education, convened for 2 days in New York City and created opportunities for dialogue between educators, artists, and art museum educators through a series of sessions organized around conversations and questions. Their goal was to shift the paradigm of education in and through visual art to better reflect contemporary artistic practices, motivations, and curiosities. This model is a revisioning of professional development that disrupts the traditional roles of individuals and institutions and provides opportunities to co-construct experiences with contemporary objects and galleries while developing inclusive pedagogical approaches framed by social issues, action, and transformation. And the third thing I'm interested in is investigating the possibilities of digital technology and social media in the museum. I'm deeply curious, as probably everyone is, about the ways in which digital technologies and social media are changing our world, specifically in the art museum environment. My own work in developing the use of interpretive materials with iPods, yeah, I was there a long time ago, iPods. I found those when I was cleaning out my office. And then I thought, does Penn State want these back? What do I do with these? And more recently, iBeacon technology at the Palmer. In addition to my role as the social media communicator on staff at the museum and my work with educational technology services at Penn State, has made me interested in the pedagogical and social possibilities that may be facilitated by technology in museums. There exists at my current institution the opportunity to generate and explore ideas with the Advanced Computing Center for the Arts and Design and art and museum education faculty and grad students. I hope to collaborate with local K-12 schools, community groups, and Columbus museums to envision, research, propose, build, pilot, and evaluate new ways of engaging museum audiences through social media, 3D printing and modeling, and digital apps specifically geared toward inclusion and exploration. All of these have the potential to profoundly shape the ways in which individuals interact with objects and with each other in the museum, and to tie into current art education research interests. So after 11 long weeks of being an assistant professor, this is what I have for you. Is more how I got here and where I hope to go in the future. This is my contact information if you're interested in talking to me. If you go on Instagram, you'll probably see pictures of you after this weekend, because I'm a pretty faithful Instagrammer. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear them.